Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. We're just going to wait a little while until more people have arrived. And then we're going to get started. So we'll leave it a few minutes just to let more people come in.
Hello, Leslie. I haven't seen you for a long time.
It's lovely. So very many people. It's full house. It's just wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Lots of waving. It's the most we can do.
Yeah.
Hi, Leslie.
Hello, Siddeep. How are you?
My God, I'm well.
Good, good.
What? It's been, what, 56 years since we last met?
I think 56.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
It's good to see you.
Likewise. And hopefully we can see each other. I'm going to be here for a bit more. I've just extended my trip.
Oh, excellent. Great.
So if you just drop me an email with your number, I'll call you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very, very exciting. Waiting for the poems to start is quite wonderful.
I'm drinking water. I'm drinking water from a beer glass, and I really feel it should be beer or something to celebrate this incredible, wonderful, wonderful number of people here.
How long? It's now, it's only 2 minutes past. Shall we wait till 5 past and then start?
I think so, yeah. Okay, folks, I'm going to take a screenshot. So everybody smile. Oh, well, hold on. I missed someone out. Hold on again. Okay, smile again. Super, thank you.
I did that thing where you smile and then just as you're refreshing your smile, the camera clicks. You're sort of stopping smiling so you can smile more genuinely, and that's when you're caught looking glum.
Yes, happened to all of us in the best of times. So good to see so many friends. Wonderful.
Isn't it?
Can I ask how many people are here?
Oh,
Roughly?
hello, Jan.
About 40, about 50.
50
so far,
yeah.
That's amazing.
Hello, Jan. How nice to see you.
It's lovely to see you, Jenny. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm looking forward to this so much, this event.
Yes. I know it's going to be brilliant. I just know it is.
We're going to be bathed in poetry.
We are.
Then we'll have to get up and go about our ordinary lives after that.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that. I think poetry ought to be an ordinary life.
Oh, that's an interesting. Now that's an interesting thing to say.
And music. And music.
Oh, and music, of course.
Thank you, Janet, for your question. You can ask, in fact,
Yes, you can.
anything you like to all of us on the chat box.
Siddeep, it
No,
was
yes, do ask on the chat box anything, any question you
on
want
the
to
chat
ask.
box. So do I wait till the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're ready.
Ready?
Mhm.
Can someone go on admitting people then?
You have to give us permission, then we can. If you make Jane, me, and Sarah co-hosts,
Okay, I don't
then
know.
we can.
I don't know quite how to do that, but I shall do my best whilst admitting people. I shall welcome you all because I'm a multitasker. Everyone who's come into this marvelous chat room today and marvelous event, welcome from all of us in Oxford. Siddeep is usually in India or traveling around the world, but we've managed to capture him today for you in Oxford and kept him in Oxford to read to you. I'll just quickly run through the shape of the event. I'm going to quickly introduce each of the poets, and then they're going to read to you for about 20 minutes. And then I'm going to have a brief conversation with them about their work. Please do put comments and questions in the chat room. At the end, if there's time, we will have a Q&A so everyone can ask.
I'll do that at 7 o'clock.
Everyone can ask the poets what they want to. If we don't have time to have the questions answered in this event, we do have your email addresses, so I will send you we'll discuss afterwards. The poets will tell me what they would have said to you had they had time, and I shall send you their answers to your questions. So I think, please, Jane has said, when you put something in the chat room, please say where you are chatting from, whereabouts in the world you are, because that's very nice to know. I expect we'll have quite an international audience. So I'm going to now get started. I think we've got quite a few of our guests already here now. So I'm going to get started. And I'm going to ask Sarah to read to us, Sarah Watkinson. First of all, I'll just read you a little bit about her. Sarah Watkinson's debut poetry pamphlet, Dung Beetles Navigate by Starlight, won the 2016 Cinnamon Press Pamphlet Prize. From 2019 to 20, she was the inaugural writer in residence at Wytham Woods, producing The Woods of Hazel with Romola Parrish. Her debut full collection, Photovoltaic, which is this wonderful book here, published in 2021, was published by Graft Poetry and is available to buy from her website and from Graft Poetry's website. Sarah is an emeritus research fellow in fungal biology. She has worked extensively. I'm just going to let someone else in. She has worked extensively on the activities of fungal networks in woodland and co-authored 3 editions of the international graduate textbook, The Fungi, which was published by Elsevier. She's interested in exploring the creative common ground between science and poetry, co-organizing interdisciplinary meetings with poets and scientists in Oxford through the Torch SciPo network, which we founded together in 2016. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you very much indeed. If I thanked everybody who'd brought me to this point where I published a poetry book, I'd never read any poetry, but I just wanted to thank Jenny, who gave me the open sesame as a scientist to the whole world of poetry, and it's been an absolute joy. So I'll start. I've been extremely lucky through Torch, the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, to be partnered with a whole number of different scientists and to work with them as a poet and on the other side of the fence. And so it's been a huge pleasure to work with the Oxford University Ecosystems Lab, led by Yadvinder Marley, who's just got an enormous grant, and nature-based solutions at the Environmental Change Institute, working on climate change mitigation. So my first poem is the result of one of these collaborations, and it involved a research scientist, Trisha Gopalakrishnan, who was working with Yadvinder Marley on woodland restoration, particularly in India, where she comes from. And with Trisha and me, our partnership was facilitated by the ABC Network facilitator, Anya Gleiser, who I think is here this evening. And she found for us the most marvelous artist, Neeli Malik. And so we got together. And this is the poem that I wrote. The words turned out to form a sort of bridge between the research topic and the artwork. Poem for COP26, Woodland Restoration. Among new portents, eroding stratosphere, pandemic eruptions, our falling towers, gather up salvage, what can be saved? Let life rewrite itself. Atoms of words, molecules of proteins, books of DNA and libraries of trees. Salvage first editions from the burning. Garner and bank seeds, capsules of local know-how. Let expert jays plant acorns in the grass. Oaks spring up from flowered thickets. New roots restore life to the scraped earth, and new branches resound with old songs. And what Neeli did was to thread those words through beautiful silk screen prints. And we showed them in Paris, which was very exciting. And again in the Oxford University Museum, also very exciting. My next poem is about the idea expressed by the psalmist, who said that all life, we're all one breath. In other words, we are all part of the tree of life. And what Darwin taught us and learnt from his evidence, highly evidence-based work, Darwin's great idea is that life on Earth wasn't created once and for all into a static pyramid with us at the top and everything else below. What was revolutionary about what Darwin had to say, and why it was very unwelcome to the average churchgoer in Victorian times, was to feel that their place in the world was fluid, because life on Earth is an ongoing process. And it's an extraordinary process. It's unique in the universe, and we are part of it, not the boss, but part of it. So here's my poem about that, All One Breath. A body is how a genome meets the world. The trees, an aqueduct from earth to sky. Light sang to the shoot, and the frond unfurled. Ours a strange country to the unborn child. Our first drawn breaths exhaled upon a cry. The body, a new genome in the world. Power swells and the plant cell tight-walled. Stems hunt the sun, the dark side giving way. Light sings the shoots up and their fronds unfold. Life on land is tensioned by Earth's hold, braced and guided by her gravity. Each species fits a genome to the world. Leaf to leaf, our crops have tiled the field to harvest every photon from the day. As light hits each new shoot, new layers unfold. All that humans are, the trees foretold. Soul and mind and hand and heart and eye. A body shows a genome to the world. Light sings to the shoot and endless forms unfurl. So, of course, we all realize that nature is very important, and at the same time we are threatening it. And we talk about nature in terms of biodiversity and all the different creatures that there are in the world, and how we now are in an age of mass extinction, and our activities are reducing the numbers of creatures we never have even come across before. And it is so very sad that this is happening. And it has now been proposed that there should be a GCSE in natural history to encourage children to be taught, particularly the names of things, and to value nature and to enjoy it as many of us here enjoyed it when we were young, in a way that is no longer possible. And when Mary Colwell, who's been the protagonist of this GCSE, was asked, what's the most important thing to teach people? She said, people should learn the names of things. And Robert Macfarlane has pointed this out too in Lost Words. Naming the animals, naming all the creatures, was the first job that God gave to Adam in the Genesis account of the creation. And I think the names of things are how we enjoy nature. It's interesting to me that human tribes have all done this in their own languages. So while we have Linnaeus naming everything in Latin for the Western culture to do science on, it's interesting to see the different ways people have, different cultures, different languages have named animals. And I was lucky enough to find myself in April 2020 beside the River Tweed in the far north of England, as far north as you can go, at sunrise. And this is the place where Turner painted his famous picture, Sunrise at Norham Castle. And this was an epiphany to Turner. He suddenly changed his painting style. It was magical. It was as if it was all new. And I had a little bit of the same feeling. And when I tried writing this up, I was surprised and amused to find that the words one wanted to use for the natural objects were Germanic and not Latinate. It was far enough north for that to be the normal sort of feeling thing. Here's the poem. Norham Castle, sunrise. Turner's epiphany was surely a morning like this. Too still, too bright for us, this früh Morgen. Da stieg ein Baum. No human sound yet. All I can see at this northern tip of England names itself to me in old tongue. Here, there seems no lingua franca word for duck, which works as well as duck. This Frühling is no primavera, no printemps. Ruhig breathes its soft G through the rising mist of the river, which is a fast-flowing fluss, not a floral fleuve. Tranquillité, repos, it's not. All bright specks and sparks, rainbows in the grass. These new-leaved bushes, I can't name a soul. The sound speaks of sallows, cycrums, salicylic acid. They're willows, Vida, and that stands for the field behind as well. Vida's water meadow, it's alive with birds. Fogels made of voice and angel, the right word for the wing-borne hymns of songbirds. Oiseau looks elegant, but write the sound out. Oiseau. Nesting in a flood-fixed bunch of dead grass high in the bushy banks were flycatchers. Fliegenfänger, yes, that's what I saw. Muschelroll for that darting flight. Ah, old Germanic fishermen, netting lacks, not so more, from the scurf there. Your words still sing. Your stone shield, long underfoot, was Hütte. No chalet could have stood these floods. So I bring you back now from the delights of North Northumberland to Wytham Woods, which is the Oxford University's ecological research site. And it was given to the university back in 1942 by the Fennell family. And it had a curious, a very specific deed of gift that charged the university with looking after it for the creatures in it, and also for the general appreciation by the local public and by study and research, and also rather charmingly to brighten the minds of children. So it's the site now of an enormous catalogue of all the creatures there, because the Oxford departments, biology departments, all work to catalogue everything in it. And it was where the idea of ecology first found a language and a lexis of its own, which was generated by Charles Elton, who's a name to conjure, and he wrote The Pattern of Animal Communities. So we have a very, very good picture of what's where in these woods. And now it's moved into the 21st century, and it's become a representative site for temperate deciduous woodland in Earth observation, global Earth observation. And so a satellite goes round and round the world, crisscrossing it like that with strings on those light lampshades made of glue and string. So the satellite pictures the whole Earth, and then an algorithm integrates what it sees. And you see a very moving sight in Wytham, which you don't see anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere, you see spring. And spring manifests itself on the globe as a wave of green, so there's a wash of green watercolor. And then at the end of the season, as the pole tilts away from the sun, the days get shorter, it begins to get colder, and Whiteham goes brown and darker and darker and darker, and it's winter. So what people in Whiteham are interested in is how the woods know to close down for winter, and how do they know to leaf at the right moment in the spring. And the timing of this is absolutely crucial for all the animals inside. And the famous example is that if bud burst comes too soon, then all the blue tits who are expecting to nest there and feed their chicks on the resulting winter moth caterpillars can't do so, because the caterpillars come before the leaf burst, or the leaf burst comes before the caterpillars. So the timing is key. Anyway, the trees always do this at the right time, and temperature affects other things. Trees know to leaf in the spring because the days lengthen, and the length of the light and the colors in the light change. There's more bright red, the red we can see in the summer. There's less and much more of the red we can't see, infrared, in the winter. So here's my poem. In Deciduous Woods. The trees are listening to their nearest star for signs that come in waves to them through space, stronger every day after the winter solstice. Beyond the 7 shades we call a rainbow, a blinkered vision red to indigo, they scan a wider spectrum for a forecast. Red, the glint of rubies, wakes their growth, but a gentler ray that's dark to us restrains and trips their raring phytochrome to off, a far red we can't see, but plants can. I think trees sense it at the edge of sunset, in the last beam through a November wood, or the warning sky of a winter dawn. It mutters to the woods, lie low, sleep on. And when they do that, the woods go very damp and dark and miserable, and the badgers who live at the far end of the northeast slope, in the right place where the soil is just right for badgers, don't actually hibernate, but they go into winter torpor. They stop rushing about mating, getting excited and so on, and just sleep most of the time and only come out for worms. So I ran some workshops for poets in Whiteham Woods, and the scientists marvelously showed us what they were up to. And the poets were inspired by this. I think everybody thought this was wonderful. And Chris Newman, who runs the Badger Survey, showed us one of his badgers. So 4 times a year, they sample a proportion of the badger population. They collect them completely humanely, but the badger's not harmed in any way. They're anesthetized, brought into the lab, health checked, and then they gradually come to, and they're taken back and released from their cage. And Chris has pointed out that for a badger, they must feel afterwards that they've had some experience like alien abduction, but it tells us exactly what's going on. So this poem is The Badger, after Michael Longley, for Chris Newman. On the table under a lamp lies the first badger I'd ever seen close up, alive in the twilight sleep of anesthesia, fresh from its muddy set, stiff hair bedraggled, a white grin of teeth, little upturned spade feet, earth clogged, in front of a hemisphere of faces, in chiaroscuro, the anatomy lesson, watching Chris's measuring hands assessing its condition. His dictated data, female, healthy, with undamaged teeth not yet chipped from stones among the worms, suggesting notes from today translated into one of those floppy picture books for toddlers, until he describes how her scent of glamour lights up multiple meetings at crossroads of their night labyrinths, Miss Dior, and of their polyandry and delayed implantation, so that a mother badger sees features of numerous fathers in her litter playing so enchantingly in the set's entrance, making it questionable to me, gingerly touching the shaving brush hair of what is just a big underground stoked cousin, if this free and undisturbed hilltop life above the roar and roadkill of the Thames Valley is enviable, especially when you're accused like a medieval leper of spreading cattle murrain, although falsely, according to Chris's analysis. Nevertheless, I wash my hands well before enjoying my post-enlightenment packed lunch. And what joy when greenery comes back. This little poem is about spring and the end of mud. And if you look after grazing animals, the end of mud is a moment of absolute joy. And it's helped by the fact that the grass will suck up the water from the mud by transpiration. It's the process by which living plants draw water from the soil and evaporate it from their leaves. Spring equinox. Someday in March, the ground is firm again. I could run down the field to the greening wood. Grass has pulled water out of mud and sent it away into the cold wind. Higher, the white sun shoots blue into puddles, outlines frost-bright leaves, sharpens the oak bark's ravines, and lights the apse of the sky.
Sarah, I think have you got one more? I think we're coming to the end of the session.
Okay, well, I'll skip on now and I will read my final poem.
Yeah, that's good.
So, reporting research results to the international scientific community, discussing collaborating in new partnerships has delights, but also terrors. And my final poem is called Flying Home from the Learned Conference. You have worked many days among strangers, speaking in auditoria with projectors that detected no signal. The listeners have taken your handouts and vanished. They have left you alone in luxury in a country where you do not read the language. You shuttle away in the darkness of night. You pass unshod out of that city before the scrutiny of the inspectors. At the gate, they inquire about your citizenship. Those allowed through hurry to board. Your seat is ready. You put away your heavy bag. The time for departure approaches. All are accounted for. The doors closed. The pilot announces clearance for takeoff. Your plane breaks from the clouds. The wingtip sparkles among known stars. Attendants smile and offer you the tea and shortbread of home. Immediately, a sheet bend forms in time, and a red line of dawn pulls you home. 5,000 miles pass in hours. Their night becomes your noon. In your own study, you record the words of those you heard. You find new collaborators among them. At Christmas, you're glad when you receive their greetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's lovely. I
Thank
just wish we could all be reading out in the open at Whiteham as your wonderful launch in a few weeks ago with the
Warmer here.
autumn. Sorry,
It's warmer here.
Yeah, but I remember the autumn leaves drifting around us as you read your poetry, which was absolutely wonderful. So yeah, I'd like to just have a quick chat. There's been a huge interest in writing about poetry at the interface of science over the past few years, especially, it seems. Why is it particularly important now to investigate this, do you think? And how has it affected you personally as a scientist and a poet?
I think it's partly because of the climate crisis and the fact that something is happening which concerns everybody as human beings. And so there's generally a greater interest in science, and particularly, I think, in biology and nature, because those touch us most closely and are most accessible. So if you go into Waterstones and look at the nature books, it's an enormous number of books and very, very good scientific journalism. So I think people are treading from across this common ground between science and poetry. And I think also our emotions around nature are sharpened by what we see around us and what we read. And of course, poetry is a way of expressing that.
Do you think the lockdowns and coronavirus, which has changed the world so drastically, do you think that's given people more of a longing to be in nature, and also a taste of how much purer nature can be without a lot of the pollution that normally goes on when all the cars had to stop going into London?
Yes, the goats in Llandudno and
absolutely, wasn't it?
And people who are fortunate enough to be able to walk around the countryside and don't have to do key work have really, in lots of ways, had a good time. I think also it's a little bit like in the Second World War in this country, there was a huge outflowing of art and interest in less material matters stimulated by the terror of the times. And I think there might be a little bit about that as well.
Mm. I just thought about it because so many people came to your workshops in the woods. And the thought of looking at bees and listening to bees and looking at badgers and just walking in mud and smelling trees seemed suddenly the most vital thing you could do. And to hear poems as well, it was an added bonus. But something that interests me, you're an emeritus research fellow in fungal biology at Oxford University. And to the uninitiated, fungi, mold and related topics might seem a bit dull, but you seem to be able to make them captivating and compelling, like your wonderful poem, which then became the prize-winning pamphlet, Dung Beetles Navigate by Starlight. You just have a gift, I think, of making ordinary topics visionary and complicated topics ordinary and accessible. So
maybe I'm just very lucky because I had a painter for a mother and a scientist for a father, and my father used to quiz me about atoms and molecules when I was 5, and my mother helped me to paint. So I do have perhaps because for that reason, I have a very visual imagination, I think.
Yeah.
That might be it.
That might be. I didn't know your mother was an artist, actually. No, that's lovely. So the poet and lecturer Steve Ely describes photovoltaic as a model of informed nature writing. And he talks about how your poetry addresses profound themes, but always with a light touch and humour. Tell us more about how you combine profound themes with humour, because it's not an easy thing to do, I think.
My goodness. Well, I think that you get very angry at what people are doing to the world, and I find parody is much the best way to express terrible anger and sadness. And you also, Jenny, you told us, I remember when you taught us about forms, that there are various forms like the sestina and the villanelle with repetition in them that are very good for obsession. And in fact, in my collection, I've put my very first villanelle that I wrote under your tutorship about habitat loss. And it's a very good way of circling a theme about which you feel quite violent, really, and at the same time making it light.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful way to end, really. And so we can sort of recommend to everyone listening and watching that when they get angry, to go and write a villanelle, perhaps.
Yes, it does a trick.
Okay, Sarah, thank you so much. That's a wonderful reading. And
thank you, Jenny.
Very inspiring, as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
And so Jane now.
Yeah,
Jane?
thank you, Sarah. Before you say anything else, Jenny, absolutely.
Yeah,
fabulous.
I know how to combine information with inspiration. I think that was a very good example. So Jane, I'll just read. I've put Jane's biography in the chat as well. I'll just read it to introduce you. Jane's previous collections from Carcanet Press include The Occupant, which was a PBS, Poetry Book Society recommendation, Over, which was a T.S. Eliot Prize shortlisted book. Prince Rupert's Drop was on the Forward Prize shortlist, and her 2011 prize-winning translation, and probably, I imagine, one of her best-known books, because everywhere I go and everyone I speak to who knows anything about poetry knows it and loves it. Other collections from Two Rivers Press include Storms Under the Skin, selected poems of Henri Michaud, 1927 to 54, and that was a PBS recommended translation, and two collections with the artist Peter Hay, Christina the Astonishing, again an absolutely astonishing book, co-authored with Leslie Saunders, who's here today, I know, and Tideway. And they're both being reissued this year. in the Illustrated Classics series. That's really exciting. Perhaps we can talk about that after you've read some poems. Jane is a former recipient of the Keats Shelley Prize for Poetry and has been the N.L. Letterfrom's Writer in Residence in Amsterdam. And she was also winner of the 2014 Hippocrates Prize for Poetry and Medicine. She's a next generation poet from 2004 and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and teaches on the postgraduate programs at the universities of Oxford and Lancaster. And I know is very, very much loved and respected teacher as well as poet. So Jane DRAYCOTT.
Jenny, that's really lovely, and this is the moment to say how very chuffed I am to be reading with Siddeep and Sarah, clearly such distinguished poets of the natural environment in this kind of SciPo context. Important to say it now in case I forget. Yeah, so it's very interesting to be reading now. So these are poems that I have put together, I would say, in the last few weeks. These are poems from my next collection, which I've just been sort of putting in the same room together. You know, you write poems and they appear in their party frocks in different magazines. Well, they've now all just been put together in their tuxedos and party frocks in the same room together, and they're sort of getting to know each other. And I've realized that in them there are quite a few poems about darkness. I hadn't realized this until really a couple of weeks ago, and when I chatting with wonderful John McAuliffe, the editor at Carcanet. And so I'm going to start with a poem which actually thinks not about darkness, but was written in a very kind of northerly latitude on June the 21st. So when there was barely any darkness at all, but there was this extraordinary blue in the air all night, a blue that appeared to have kind of come from somewhere else. It was quite extraordinary. And so this is a poem called The Experiment that came out of that. Dearests, I have arrived. Some things have already been taken. The small blue bowls and airmail stationery, the summer tablecloth, only slightly blue, and the half light is now quite cleared. All I can say is, try when you come not to think of the dark. Take the boat and do the experiment. You will have to put every ounce of what you know into it, or it will never lift off or be carried across. In a small country like ours, you must be prepared for no one to think this is possible. Like the first pioneers of flight, those two close, so close all their lives, watching the wind and birds, their dazzling feats and equilibrium. Sleep is chalky now. Most of the underblue has gone from beneath the bed. Only the light remains, and the roses, wild and idle, just as you will remember them. Stay together whenever the times allow. As I say, Siddeep and Sarah are clearly, clearly the kind of expert poets here in terms of, writing imaginatively about the natural environment. And this is a tiny kind of small contribution, small coda that comes up behind their work. It's called In Their Platoons. By midnight, when it was all over, there was no one, just the woods moving in their platoons at the edges of the fields, signalling to each other with their leaf action. No more tree hugging or healing, no more sushi chains, no more psychological thrillers, no more where is my husband? At last, they have the place to themselves, and in their branchy arms, the entire future to optimize. Birds, rainfall, the next new myths. I realized as well, looking at these poems together, as I say, they're chatting away to each other in this new room they've been put in, this cell they've been locked into together, which is the new collection. For some reason or other, there are kind of several poems seen from the air, from the perspective of kind of above. And actually, I have to say now, this is the first time I've ever told anyone, and now I'm telling 63 people. I have just recently had my first ever that I can remember, dream of flying. And I'm sure this says lots about how inadequate my life must be, or has been to this date. But somebody told me that it's one interpretation is that it's a sign of happiness, and I think isn't that a wonderful thing? So here's a poem seen from the air. Actually, it's got nothing to do with that dream I've just had, that pipe dream I had more recently. It's called Our Town and the Falcon. This is roomy country, and not just from the air. Down here in town now, we've all got several streets to ourselves. I like to walk the place at dawn, as if I were the only person on the planet. Our resurfaced car park, out only. Our new public toilets, built to resemble a small alpine chalet. Our hangars and school halls, cleared but for the rolls of decommissioned razor wire. Authorized arrivals only. Lots of room for the individual. We have emptied our hearts and minds. Feelings rush towards us from the vacant sky. Bits of asteroid rush towards us, homing in like a falcon, bringing fresh new evidence of how this could all have begun. We are preparing to meet that incoming space dust in every possible way we can think of. I suppose right now we're all just, or at least those of us who are up here in the northern latitudes, we're all quite conscious in this moment in the new year of tiny incremental bits of extra light in the morning, earlier, that Frühmorgen that Sarah was talking about. But obviously there are parts of the world, inhabited parts of the world in the Arctic regions where winter still has a very long time to go, and it's a very long time since they saw the light. And it's an extraordinary culture in those latitudes. So this is a poem simply called At This Latitude. Polar day is such a magical time. People walk by the lake together until late, enjoying the warmth and the golden light. Sometimes it's hard to sleep, even in imperfect surrender. But people are happy, and the light is so golden together out late by the lake. Polar night creeps in slowly, like a discreet arresting officer, till one morning round coffee time, you understand there will be no more light until next year. Like climbing alone into an MRI scanner, the cold slicing through you like meat at the deli counter, the fear that the sun will never return. Time passes into a blender. People grow feral. It's hard not to let the bitter winds take you. Is it wrong to resist, to desire to live elsewhere than this? Sarah was talking earlier about the incredible sweep of green that the geostationary satellites can catch and then make available to us as an image, as an animated reality. And this is a poem which it actually thinks about, or began by looking at the nighttime images that those geos. So NASA, you can find them on the NASA website, sort of the Earth at night. It's called The Shine. Electric delta, lily flower, papyrus, Alexandria. So sees the nighttime satellite, the neon miles, Shanghai, Mumbai, the full moon trampolining off the continents of ice. And in the wide, blind countryside, the lesser fires, 1,000 isolated signal lamps, a small child's failing torch, the lonesome phones, a tide of phytoplankton clinging to the hull of night. Such candle power, lit at the shrine of darkest space. Could this be too much light? I'm just going to read a couple more poems, thinking about the sort of human side of medicine. This is, some of you here will know the wonderful writer and consultant, Dr. Sam Gugliani, who was who's a writer who actually you and I, Jenny, worked with on the Masters in Creative Writing here at Oxford, and he writes a wonderful column in the Lancet, thinking about the human side of medicine, which has become in so many spheres, obviously increasingly technical. So, last two poems. The first one is just simply called Marathon, about a marathon runner, or about someone running a marathon. Across this field, the farmers left a track for you to race down, sky, wheat, sky, machine straight banks of remedies, a corridor you run each visiting night to see her, nil by mouth, no flowers. In the tumbling air, the plants secure their future lives. As through the double doors you race the holloway, its leafy tracts and ducts, as one might run to bring news, raise funds, catch a person leaving. You'd run for years if need be, X-ray, penicillin, X-ray, this sea of corn, you'd swim it like Leander, there and back each evening, guided by the light beam at her window, laser, chemo, laser, outpaced at last by racing winds, the lamp extinguished, questions still to ask. Why all the dust, the flies? What are your reasons for running? And lastly, this is a poem called The Kingdom. And some of you might kind of recognize references to the New Testament, to Matthew and to the accounts of the Sermon on the Mount. But it began as I was reading an account of early English hospitals, the history of English hospitals, which were principally then places of refuge, shelter, you know, places of care for the soul, more than modern hospitals, which principally are about the care of the body. But anyway, this is called The Kingdom, and I'll finish with this one. There are some Middle English words in this, which with their Middle English spellings, but they're quite audible in Modern English as well. The Kingdom. I was hungry, coming up from Kent, resorting hither after the summer. My tent a riverbed, seeking herbergement, some accommodation among the stone. The men coming onto you, the taxi drivers saying, here, jump in, no, you don't need no money. I was thirsty, languishing in the doorway behind the post office, the churchyard water so cold for washing. what aileth thee, woman? And from my mouth came leaves, and from the cracks in the pavement came syllables. I was a stranger, turned half to stone, seeking relief in severe weather, coming hither in search of something out of this madness, something to inherit. Thank you.
Fantastic, Jane. Thank you so much. And that last poem is the title, isn't it? The title poem.
Yes,
of
that's the
new-
title poem, The Kingdom.
And when will the collection be available?
October, November, yes, autumn, I hope.
Autumn. Great.
Yes.
Can't wait. I'm very lucky, very pleased to have some of the poems here, through which I was knocked out by. But your poems have been described as mysterious and enigmatic and haunting, which reminds me of Bernard O'Donoghue's remark that the best poems are those which where it takes a while for the penny to drop. So you don't get it immediately, but maybe that evening or the next morning, something starts coming through to your subconscious. Would you agree with
But it makes them sound wonderful, actually.
They are
But
wonderful.
yeah, that idea of it taking a while for the penny to drop, if that's the case for the reader, I mean, I think that's because it's the case when I'm writing them. So you know, they start out. I mean, the wonderful late poet Michael Donoghue, I'm sure lots of you know his work. He would talk about how he used to say, I'm in it for the discovery. Don't ask me what it means. I'm in it for the discovery, you know.
Yeah.
So a poem as a kind of active project of investigation, something interests you, and you kind of you follow it down that dark corridor with your small, you know, or into the dark room that Virginia Woolf talks about, shining your torch on different areas in that space and trying to work out what those make as a whole, because you can only see small sections of it at a time. And so you start to write, and at some point, if you're lucky, you get the sense that you could let the poem into the driving seat, you know, and then you are a passenger. You're a passenger in the poem.
Then you really don't know where you're going.
Then off it goes, and yes, and then you end up with these lovely labels like mysterious and enigmatic. And
yeah, well, I think that's wonderful. It's
something like that.
I know why people say that, because it's sort of like stepping through the subconscious in a way, and things suddenly become clear, you know.
Yes.
But as we teach together on the Master of Studies now, I think quite a few of our wonderful students are here today.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you for being our students.
Yes, lucky us.
I know that you say to them, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. I'm not sure I know that's a quote by someone. I'm not.
That's Robert Frost.
Who was it? Who was it?
It's Robert Frost in his preface, The Figure a Poem Makes.
So how do you help students to surprise themselves with their poetry?
It's an interesting, quite scary thing for students who aren't necessarily very experienced in poetry. But I mean, I think one of the things, it connects with that idea of letting the poem into the driving seat, sort of Tesla experiment. One of the things I say to them actually is that obviously there's a sort of urgency about your subject matter, or a sense of the territory that you want to explore, and it seems to be asking to be explored in a kind of poetic approach, that kind of heightened language, or language which doesn't need to explain itself at every moment. And one of the things I say, which I hope helps, is I quite often quote the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, who said, when asked about his practice, he said, "I don't take photographs. It is the photograph that has taken me." Well, that's my sort of poor paraphrase of his French, but that idea that you're the kind of subject of the material, or subject to the material, and that you write in a kind of humility about the material, not knowing where it's going. And that can feel like a kind of quite scary approach, I think, because you write thinking, I must write, it feels urgent to you and you feel you own it. But I think that's how you actually come to the thing that Keats talked about, a poet is the most unpoetical thing in existence, you know, that a poet is continually filling some other body. Even though the kind of action of writing poetry feels very intimate, and the reading of poetry is a very intimate connection with the writer.
Lots of people are responding in the chat and saying here well, just
okay. Oh, are they?
So this on your book, it says you know, the notes for your book say, how do we face the ever continuing approach of the unknown? And I wondered at what stage of writing the poems, when you started to get them all together for a collection, and I think students and other poets will be interested in this. When did you realize this was the unifying theme, when you had to find a title, you know?
Yes. Well, really quite recently. It's interesting because some collections, you know with some collections that you have a theme, or you know, a deliberate kind of territory, imaginative territory, narrative territory that you want to explore in more than one poem or several sequences of poems. And these are poems which I've written quite slowly over the last 4 years. A lot of them are from before lockdown. But putting them together, as I say, very, very recently, I realized that a lot of them are about what we've all come to understand rather sort of brutally, and for a lot of people in terrifying ways, about how little we know, about how little we can actually predict or know what's coming. And I kind of think I've been interested in medieval, a lot of sort of medieval, not literary pieces, but like herbariums and dictionaries and medieval encyclopedias. That attempt to pin down what you do know in what is essentially, a rather sort of uncertain world, or the edge of the known world is actually quite sort of fragmented. You know, there's
so almost like creating some kind of signposts or recognizable landmarks that
or just nailing it in some way, which is virtually impossible to do, actually.
No, that's really interesting. So just quickly, I just want to talk about the technical skill, because underneath this mysteriousness is tremendous technical skill and nuance. For example, your imagery, I just have to say, I had to bring this up, the explosive energy of a line like the full moon trampolining off continents of ice.
Yes.
Hang on, I've got to let some people into the waiting room who sadly missed that poem, but and that's from the poem The Shine. And from At This Latitude, there's a wonderful exploitation of hiatus through enjambment. You say polar night creeps in slowly like a discreet, and then there's a double space where we have to wait to see what this discreet, and it's a discreet arresting officer. So one morning around coffee time, you understand there will be no more light. I mean, I just think that's absolutely wonderful.
Well, that is super kind of you, Jenny. Yeah, I suppose in a way I like, it's very everything you've said. In a way, I do think of myself as a technician, really. You know, that when I go to write, I'm sort of going into the workshop or the lab, you know. I mean, I think that's what I love about working with language, and in a way it's very simultaneous. It is all simultaneous. So harmonic patterning, metrics, phrasing, rhythm, that's all simultaneous with developing imaginative, content, or what's going on in your mind's eye. I think that's it. It's the kind of simultaneity of what's going on in your ear and what's going on in your mind's eye. And
and you bring it all together, which is
yes, well, I think every poet does. I think every
that's
poet
what
does.
we're all aiming for, really.
Yes, yes.
Jane, thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure to hear you read.
No, well, thank you for.
And I know everyone enjoyed it very, very much. So, Siddeep Sen, hello, our captive. I'm just going to show everyone the wonderful book cover, which is Siddeep's new book. He's actually been on a book tour for 3 months, is it, Siddeep?
Yes.
And he's been in Cambridge for a couple of months on a residency and seemingly traveling all over the place, and doing a lot of readings in person, which was great. It was just in between lockdown regulations. And but I've put his biography has been put in the chat room, so do sort of refresh your mind afterwards, or I'll just quickly introduce him. Well, it's hard to be quick because you've done so much. You're such a world traveler and a knowledgeable and wonderful poet. Siddeep's prize-winning books include Postmarked India, New and Selected Poems, HarperCollins, Rain Aria, an A.K. Ramanujan Translation Award, that won that prize. Fractals, New and Selected Poems, from London Magazine Editions, Aerotext, Vintage, Penguin, Random House, Kaifa Azmi Poems from Bloomsbury, and this Anthropocene, I hope I pronounce it right, is it? Climate Change, Contagion and Consolation from Pippa Ram Books. Siddeep's also edited many influential anthologies, including the HarperCollins Book of English Poetry, The World English Poetry and Modern English Poetry by Younger Indians, Blue Nude, Ekphrasis and New Poems, won the International George Zalamia International Poetry Prize, and The Whispering Anklets are forthcoming. I'll ask you about that after you've read to us. His work's been translated into over 25 languages. He's been very widely broadcast and published, his essays and criticism. And he's the editorial director of Arts and the editor of Atlas, and currently the inaugural, you've just finished, have you, at Cambridge, or the inaugural artist in residence at the Museo Camera. I don't know what that is, but, and importantly, Siddeep is the first Asian honoured to deliver the Derek Walcott Lecture and read at the Nobel Laureate Festival. So welcome, Siddeep. We're looking forward very much to hearing your poems.
Thank you. And I can actually say good evening rather than saying good morning or good night when I sort of just join on Zoom, at least 5 or 6 or 8 hours behind or ahead of various programs I've been on. And ironically, of course, all of us, this was supposed to be a live in-person program in the beautiful Brody Room in St. Hilda's, but Oxford decided to put the sluice gates down and make us remask again. So we are unmasked in our private rectangular squares, ironically, all in Oxford at the moment. But thank you, Sarah and Jane, for this sterling performance. I mean, just the poems just leap out so luminously and so beautifully. And I just stopped at that particular phrase of yours, Jane, electric delta. My goodness me, how do you do this, So I'm going to read a poem which is not from Anthropocene. because of that particular phrase, electric delta, because there's a poem I wrote called Banyan, which is actually a poem for you, which was one of the Poetry Society prizes, which has the word electric. And not just that, it just also links up with Sarah's beautiful title, Photovoltaic. So how can you not read a poem which was not on the list, but has to be read? It's an old poem. Banyan, of course, as you all know, is a big, big tree. And as a child, we used to run around it, play hide and seek. You know, the tertiary roots touch the ground, and then over many decades, it becomes like a big hive-like, wonderfully wondrous ecological cave. And parts of the cave are so dense that you actually need a torchlight or a candle. And the wonderful thing about, inflammability is, people think, oh gosh, don't take a candle in. Trees and nature are much more resilient. Because a tree is fresh, a candle is not going to burn the tree down, actually. So, we were told by the wise people that it's okay to take a candle or a lamp in, which is, as long as you're using organic fuel, it's fine. Thank you, Jenny, for inviting me, and it's lovely to be with so many friends. So I'm going to read Banyan from Fractals first and then get on to Anthropocene. Banyan. As winter secrets melt with the purple sun, what is revealed is electric. Notes tune unknown scales, syntax alters tongues, terracotta melts white. Banyan ribbons into armatures as branch roots twist, meeting soil in a circle. Circuits glazed under cloth carry alphabets for a calligrapher's nib, italicized in invisible ink. Letters never posted, photographer's map uncharted. As phrases fold, so do veils. And I'll read this poem. It's also in Fractals. It faces Banyan. And I was talking to Jenny and Sylvia yesterday, and also Charlotte, who's here actually, that I love companion poems. I just think I'm just drawn to this whole idea of companion poems. For instance, Milton's Le Allegro and El Penseroso is a good example, how they talk to each other, but they're so distinctly, mutually exclusive at one point. So this one's called Winter. And because I'm in superly cold country and space, I think it's appropriate. It was written in Delhi, I have to add, where even at 12 degrees, we find it extremely cold, but here people take their shirts off. But there we go. And it's dedicated to my partner, Simi. Winter. Couched on crimson cushions, pink bleeds gold, and red spills into one's heart. Broad leather keeps time, calibrating different hours and different zone, unaware of the grammar that makes sense. Only random woofs and snores of two distant dogs on a very cold night clears fog that is unresolved. New plants wait for new heat to grow, to mature. And old cane recliner contains poetry for peace, woven text keeping comfort in place. But it is this impatience of want that keeps equations unsolved. Heavy, translucent, vaporous, split red by mother tongues. Winter's breath is pink. Thank you. Very kind. This clapping is It's good. I wish we were all together. So I'll now read from my new book, Anthropocene, which is sort of the UK edition is just out. And it's been wonderful actually to, run away from not just India, from anywhere, because I was actually, we were not allowed to travel for 2.5 years. We were on the red list. And just to get onto a plane, which I'd forgotten how to do, and get to some other places, just been so freeing. And then being embraced by all of you, in cold England. And it's just been really, really uplifting. So thank you all. This one is the second poem in the book called Disembodied. And this was written early during the lockdown, but climate change is a topic I've been, keenly involved with for the last at least 15 odd years. So the book wasn't written because of the pandemic. It was something that I was doing in any case, but the last 1.5 years just accelerated the whole thing, and the book was put together. This is based in Delhi, located in Delhi. The geographical space is Delhi, but it could be any big city or any part of the world. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from Aurora Borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from the fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there's color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped not for its blessing, but its contour, artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal, and not by season's first rains, skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no pole star navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away, just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there's too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass. I'll read 2 companion poems. As I said, I'm obsessed with them over the years. This one is, I'm now reading from my new book, all of them. This one's called Obituary, and I'll have to show you this. I don't know whether you can see it. There were 2 occasions early during the lockdown that the New York Times had the front page, which was all blacked out. And on another occasion, they just had the list of people who just died during the first wave. And of course, they're not all the names. And it's such a dramatic graphic that you can't but not respond to it. Of course, beyond the graphic element, the times one was living in, it was such a flurry of uncertainty and so on, that this poem Obituary came about. And I used the New York Times headline just as an epigraph to contextualize the poem. And I quote, "They were not simply names on a list, they were us." Death knell peal, numbers multiply, virus ravages us one by one. Newspaper columns loom, unsteady ghostly apparitions on broadsheets, name, age, date of death, tall epitaphs in fine print. Ink spills, bleeds dark, newsprint blotting out our wheezing breath. No amount of hygiene ritual enables our lungs to resuscitate. Our lives, micropoint-sized fonts on an ever-inflating pandemic list, black specks, fugitive lonely numbers, the deceased on an official roster, another sick, another dying, another dead. Yes, they were us. The companion poem to this, again, is a photograph which I took. You can't see it very clearly. It's super subtle. So in printing terms, it's a pain in the butt to get it reproduced unless you use very, very good high quality art matte paper, because they're just two slivers of line. Essentially, the photograph is a black photograph with just two lines in it. What happened was winter's night again, and in Indian homes, our houses are not heated like it is here. So it's largely meant for summer. So the floors are made of stone and so on, essentially for the summer to keep the cool in. So you're under the duvet and you have to go to the loo. And so you go to the loo, and it's even that is a struggle, because should I get out of the duvet and go or not? You have to make these grand life decisions. Anyway, so I went there, came out, shut the door. I forgot to put the light off, and the door was slightly ajar, and there were these two lines of light creeping through. And I looked at it and I said, gosh, there's a poem. Crazy. Of course, it's not very good for relationships, because when you get inspired at these odd moments, you have to, of course, again have to creep out of your bed and go to your study. Doesn't, because very often if you don't write it down then, or just at least write out the first draft, it's gone, it's flown away next morning, however skilled and experienced you are about writing poetry. These things are very magical at one level. It's called Hope, Light Leaks. And it's also around the time when George Floyd was killed and all that was happening. It opens with a short epigraph from Martin Luther King Jr., and I quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." Late at night, light leaks, spilling beyond the door's rectangle edge, a cleaving schism, its shape a partial crucifix, a new resurrection. Light's plane waxes and wanes, viral load expands, contracts. Photons spill, conduction sparks, light slow removes, cataracts veil. In this blackness, lives matter. The book is not as grim as you think. a very important part of the book. The book is divided into 3 parts: is climate change, contagion, and then consolation. And without light, we can't go on. Without positivity, we can't face the next day. The world has become so right-wing, so toxic, that it's actually very, very difficult to navigate through this sort of viral germ, algae-like sort of viscosity of terror in a sense. So it's very, very important in some ways to think of light and look at it. Actually look at the thing, sun, the trees don't complain, the birds come and chirp, the sun comes out every day. It's only us stupid human beings who are angst-ridden with things like what's happening around us. Of course we need to be, but if you have a more holistic picture of what the cosmos does and the world does, then we can be probably kinder to each other and then to the earth, which is high time. So this is a poem, which is the first poem in the book, and it's a short little poem. It's dedicated to my son Arya, spelled A-R-I-A. And I sent this poem to him, and he said, "Oh, Baba, another poem." He's sort of he's 23. But if I send him anything to do with poetry or literature, he'll sort of groan and grunt. But he said, "Actually, Baba, it's a beautiful poem." And I was shocked. So I said, that's good. At least you've responded aesthetically. The rest of it, it can soak in if you have another beer or a drink, and maybe you might see some light. But it's dedicated to him. And I work a lot with musicians and dancers, and a wonderful thing happened over the last 2 years because so many of the events are Zoom oriented. You're reading to audiences perhaps you wouldn't have otherwise reached in one go. So this American songwriter, composer called Heather Ann Shepard, who was on one of the Zoom readings I did, and I saw her again, and then I saw her again. And she wasn't stalking at all, clearly, but she emailed me and said, "I just read the book, and is it okay if I make songs out of them and make an album?" What do you say? Of course you say yes. And so this poem has also been made into a song, and now I think the first album is on Spotify if you want it. It's titled That Is, and the poem is titled That Is, I.E. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't know how I'm doing with time. Maybe I should read 2 more poems?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Definitely. You've been about 20 minutes now, so.
Okay, I'll read, yeah. This is called language. And of course, that this is our tool. So there has to be, moments in every poetry book where we sort of pay homage to the gods of language and the tools we use. And this is a poem that's dedicated to my old manual typewriter, which still works, but it's very difficult to make it work, and because it's so difficult to get the red and black silk ribbons. It's so difficult to source. In fact, the ribbons are more expensive now than the typewriter itself. But of course, it's also about the way language is twisted in the modern world with fake news and so on and so forth. It opens with an epigraph from Italo Calvino, and I quote, "Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally." My typewriter is multilingual, its keys mysteriously calibrating my bipolar forked tongue. Black red silk ribbons, pools, unwind as the carriage moves from right to left. In cursive hand, I write from left to right. My tongue was born promiscuous, speaking in many languages. My heart spoke another, my head yet another. The translation seamless. Auricles, ventricles pump blood. Corpuscle-like alphabets, phrases, syntax, cross-fertilize my text, breathing life. Texture enriched, music, cadence spatially enhanced, osmotic, polyglottal, a polygamy of grammar. Letterforms dance, ligatures pirouette, ascenders, descenders, pitch perfect. Imagination isn't caged in speech. Speech cannot be caged in language.
Wonderful, thank you.
I think I'll end there.
That's
Because
an,
I've stopped my thinking.
that's an absolutely brilliant line to end on. It's such a memorable. I'm just writing it down. Actually, speech cannot be caged in language, and that's such a great poem about translation, and of course the metaphors under it. How important is translation to you? Because you translate to and from many languages. So. Yeah.
I think it's terribly important. I mean, most of my knowledge of world poetry and world literature is through translation. I don't know French, or well, I mean, I know smattering of French and Italian, just the wine labels I like. I mean, that's just shockingly very poor, level of proficiency. But I do understand Urdu, Bangla, and some other Indian languages. So a lot of world literature and has come through wonderful translations. I mean, I wouldn't know any of Russian literature, French literature, or Spanish literature, or Latin American literature, had there been no translation. So I'm really, really grateful for that. The other thing, of course, parallelly that happens, I'm so privileged to have been born and brought up in India, where actually it's a very normal thing in the house, for instance, to speak in a kind of mosaic language. Because most people know at least 3 to 5 languages, and it's not unusual, most people do. So in the same sentence, you'll be using 3 different languages. Also, it's so mood dependent. If my dad and I are watching cricket, we sort of resort to English for some strange reason. If he's having good whiskey, then we might curse in Bangla, and my mother might shout to the vegetable owner in Hindi because that's the language on the streets. And it's sort of completely polymorphous, polyglottal, poly, everything. Yeah. So it's really something that I've grown up with, and I'm immensely grateful because, I would be so much poorer as a writer and reader, as a human being, if I couldn't read the other things and understand the sound patterns. So I feel I am a better poet because I translate from other languages.
Yes.
It's really, really matured my own writing over the years. I came to translating poetry quite late in life, formally that is. I remember I was at a poetry festival in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem International Poetry Festival, which was directed by Yehuda Amichai. And it was a brilliant, one of the best festivals I've been to. 7-day long, spouses are and girlfriends, boyfriends, dogs, everybody, they're all invited. As long as you pay for their airfare, they're invited. They're put up in the same hotel, they're fed. And what they did was very interesting because most of the readings were sort of 4 o'clock onwards. So 4, then 6 and 8. So you had the day free. Yeah. You're not like stressed that you have a reading at 11:38 in the morning and then nobody shows up, and and then the night readings, 8 o'clock, the prime time readings. There was no hierarchy, so it was all in the evening. And during the day, they had these wonderful tours set up for your partners so that they can enjoy themselves to see the old city of Jerusalem or go shopping or go to the Red Sea. And if you didn't want to do that, there was a translation workshop that was set up. led by Danny Weisbord, who, you know, co-founded with Ted Hughes, the Modern Poetry in Translation, MPT, and Stanley Moss, who also, you know, runs a press in America. So they were the translator leaders. I said, and Yehuda Amichai himself. So I said, it's really silly not to go and enroll for this workshop, because when would you have a chance of all these people? Now, so we were given this poems by Abraham Ben-Itzhak. Apparently, he wrote only 12 or 16 poems in his entire lifetime in Hebrew, and it's supposed to be classic. I mean, so they had this, you know, they had 4 linguists in the workshop, and they gave us the English literals. They had 4 Hebrew scholars, 4 English expert translators, and then some sort of gate crashers like us, you know, a few poets from the festival who just sort of sat in and did it. It was incredible. You know, I remember my friend Zoran Anchevsky from Macedonia. He and I were the 2 poets who kind of came in, you know, signed on to this fairly seriously. And we were translating like this because, you know, for us, it was another poet translating another poet. So once the material was given to us, and the poem was read out in Hebrew, you get it very quickly. Whereas the real translators and the academics were going bananas, you know, getting this. And most of the time they came up with very staccato, you know, stodgy translations. Content-wise, dead right, 100% accurate. No soul. No music. Very little lyricism.
Ezra Pound said a long time ago, when he'd been translating from Chinese, published, I think it was 1920, similar, in his book Cathay. He said he didn't speak Chinese, never been to China. He based it all on Ernest Fenolos's Chinese, reading Chinese, you know, from the idiomatic characters. And Ezra Pound said, forget the words, just reach in and get the spirit of the poem, you know.
I mean, you know, there's a slightly flawed sort of situation with that too, because, you know, when you revisit them and you know a little bit more about the history of those poems, I mean, subsequently I've read several Chinese translations of the same text which Pound had done, and you see the kind of sort of flawed translation. But because Pound was such a fine poet,
well, there you are.
In India, we have another kind of subset of translation called transcreation. There's a whole study called transcreation, and they were transcreations actually, perfectly valid, you know, as poems. But yes, I think translation is a very important thing. And, you know, all of you are such fine translators. Jenny, you do fantastic translations. And
yes, but this is great to know this word, transcreation, because that's what I do. I translate from languages I don't speak.
Yes. And it's possible, I mean, just to the people who are here, to let them know how it happens. It's not that mysterious. I've translated from Hebrew and Icelandic. Why? Because I have some very good friends who are poets from these countries, and we just, at poetry festivals, we meet and like each other's translations, of course, what they read. And I said, gosh, this should be known to other people. So you just sit down and try and translate, because their English tends to be fairly good, and they give you the entire English literals. And of course, you know, you wrote the introduction to my book of translations in the Aria. And I have a whole scientific method. I've sort of evolved how to do these things, because I was a science student. So I bitmap every poem sonically. Each line is first mapped as a music score. I have no idea which words I'm going to put in.
That's amazing.
So I'll have a sheet in front of me which is technically correct without the words in it first.
Yes.
And then I'll go back.
Because you grew up surrounded by so many different musical tones, you know, and registers in a way, maybe that has allowed you to become more sort of sensitive.
That and the fact that I was a science student to start with.
And so you're able to break it down and do it. I mean, T.S. Eliot says Ezra Pound is the creator of Chinese poetry for the West, ironically. And of course, it's not the Chinese that was written, but it's a very, very interesting debate.
Yeah, and there was a lot of stealing going on, like the Empire did too, you know, Om Shanti,
Yes,
Shanti, Shanti,
yes,
which
yeah.
is, you know, an Indian chant, you know, became more famous because of, you know, Wasteland.
Yeah.
I mean, which is fine, but it's kind of out of context, but it's okay.
Yeah.
Forgiven.
Yeah. Anyway, we could go on talking all night about translation alone, but I just want to talk about Carolyn Forshey has described Anthropocene as an expansive, urgent and wonderful book. And you have described climate change as a metaphor for our times. Can you say a bit more about that? And also, do you think poetry can help in our fight against climate change?
I think poetry is a very, very powerful tool, as we all know. Of course, all of us in this room, in this congregation, so to speak, are completely sold to that religion of poetry. So we are very biased. So we know all the biblical lines of poetry backwards, you know, how do you twist a sestina into a villanelle and so on, and have fun with such things. So we share the poetic language and grammar. So we are biased, but, you know, let's face it, in times of any crisis, we resort to poetry. It's not fiction we resort to. Even very banal things. Often on our bedside table, it'll be a book of poetry that we dip in and dip out. I also have novels there, but once I finish the novel, it goes into my library shelves. And if it's not outstanding, it never gets revisited again. But poetry books, you know, have a kind of interesting life because they visit my bedside table very often, even if I've read it again. And I make different sort of notes on them. Poetry is all around us. Poetry is all around us. In the most critical times, we resort to poetry: birth, death, love, war, anything.
I think that's such an interesting point, Siddeep, to say when you've read a novel. I mean, I know some people reread novels, the set one novel, they have a sort of a Dickens novel or something like that they read over and over again. It's a sort of comfort, but you don't tend to keep rereading novels, whereas with poetry you do want to go back and reread and reread and reread your favorite poems. So that gives poetry.
And the favorite poems also evolve over time, depending on where you are intellectually and emotionally, because, you know, I will read a certain kind of poetry and certain sets of poems, a certain part of the world. It's just one of those wonderful shape-shifting, tectonically, wonderfully, you know, geographically and tectonically perfect fractals that keep moving about, because you can jump from one iceberg to the other iceberg without the fear of drowning, because the drowning itself is part of discovery, you know. Because once you're sort of immersed in this kind of polysyllabic, dactylic waters, then, you know, you don't know what temperatures you have to swim, tides you have to swim again. So that's poetry on its own. You know, so, but of course, you know, people like us are so, you know, madly biased that the word P will get us excited. Forget the entire two-syllabic word. But it is very much something that, you know, it helps in times of crisis. You know, songs and prayers, chants. It's all different forms of poetry. Music is certainly vocal music is. Even sheet music is poetry, because, you know, it's very, very structured in many ways. And in times of crisis, we resort to that. And look at the amount of poetry that's happening now, you know, on the internet. I mean, I'm not saying a lot of it is, you know, palatable, but yes, you know, there's much more. Yeah, so it's very, very, it's critical.
That's very important, actually, talking about music, because I know you write music and you collaborate with musicians a lot, and your poetry, I've written this little quote from The Tempest. Caliban says to Stefano and Trinculo, "Be not afraid, the isle is full of noises." And I think your poetry is the same, you know, they not just the actual sounds and rhymes and half rhymes, but the way, the metrical arrangement. I just like to ask you a bit more about that. I know that you've invented forms that are based on the dance with the dancer with her anklet. So I know that's actually based on the footsteps of the dance, isn't it? Can you
Yes.
tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so these are fun stuff because, because I'm interested in physics and mathematics,
Yeah.
it just comes naturally. So I was watching this dancer rehearse, and because of my interest in photography, I said, I'm not going to shoot her from, the front on, which is what we see. We see the XY axis of the stage and imagine the depth, which is the Z axis. What if I were the lights boy on top and stand on the grid and see it from a bird's eye point of view, because you don't see dance that way, certainly performative dance, which is meant for a proscenium space. So I watched this wonderful dancer, and I was photographing her for 3 days. And then I looked at all the sort of photographs, and I just made a little graph and photocopied it black and white just to see the patterns, because color photography, you don't see the patterns as easily. And I realized all the dance steps she was making partly reflected the raga she was dancing to. Ta dhin ta tai thai ta, ta dhin ta tai thai ta. So I said, what? And somewhere 13th or 14th or 20th draft of the poem, I realized, that's something I can take the poem towards. So then I invented this rhyme scheme, which is not in the English language, ABACC, no, whatever it is, and it's very formal. And I wrote the poem using that particular structure. And now it's sort of in these, form books of poetry that this has been done. Same thing very early on in my writing career as a young poet. I was living in New York City, and I wrote this poem, New York Times, which you may be familiar with. Early days when we knew each other, I would read that poem out. And somewhere along the line, I said, this poem should really reflect the geographical space I'm in. So the poem, each stanza is in 5 lines. 5 lines, of course, reflect the 5 boroughs in New York City: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Bronx, etc. And the shape of each stanza kind of mimics the shape of the island itself, Manhattan. And when you turn the stanza 180 degrees or 90 degrees, change the axis, the top of the poem and the bottom of the poem works like the mirror image of the buildings reflected on the water. So the rhyme scheme there is ABXBA. So the first 2 lines reflect the last 2 lines, and the middle line is the X line, which is the mirror line.
Right. Okay.
So I kind of, it sort of happened because I was also having fun with this, So ABXBA is a new rhyme scheme which has not been done.
No, that's the nearest.
That's the New York Times, yeah.
The nearest I think is a Rubaiyat, which has an X. It's a monorhyme, isn't it, with an X line in there? But that's nowhere near as spatially ambitious as yours.
No, and it didn't start off with me wanting to do it as such. It wasn't an agenda at all. It just evolved. So just to just very, very humbly to contribute quite accidentally to the world of English poetry or whatever it is, new formal stanzaic patterns is just actually quite fun. I've done more of them. I remember, because also part of it is, my upbringing was, my parents, I grew up in a family which was very noisy. Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize for economics some years ago, wrote this wonderful book, nonfiction book you should read, called The Argumentative Indian. And we just argue a lot, and we are very noisy. We love food and drink. We sing, we hug. Way too much. I mean, we're super tactile in many ways. And so when I'm in the West, I have to just sort of, lock myself in a space and not touch, because here, of course, implications are different. You don't touch a young child or a dog, lest you'll be sort of called something. Anyway, so people knew the poems by heart, I mean, the duns and the galibs and everything, busy old fool, unruly son, or Richard II, old John of Gaunt, time honored Lancaster, as thou according to, and so on. You know the first act by heart. because
yeah.
you read it out, and people are just sort of performing it in a kind of mad kind of way.
It's sort of rather like the Irish tradition, I think.
Yeah, yeah. It's poetry is
and
I
also the Arabic,
human level.
people,
Arabic too. Arabic
ordinary
too.
people, just, you don't have to be a poet or an academic, just ordinary people, like my mum, who wouldn't read, who would be frightened of poetry, would not really know anything about poetry.
Yeah.
But I think in Arab countries, poetry is known, and
actually, Jenny, the thing is, in 80% of the world, it's like that. But, the definitions of poetry have been made by very few people in the white Anglophone kind of container. So if you look at poetry through that lens, then all this sounds really fascinating. We were coming from that kind of mad, raucous space.
Sorry, can you take over, Jane? I've got to get some water, sorry.
Yeah, when you come from a different kind of space, it's actually, in fact, I have to quieten down when I'm in English-speaking Western countries, I have to restrain myself.
And do you think there's something in the poetry as well? If you look at the poetry, that you're finding, let's say here, you've been here for 3 months and probably doing readings. Do you think that applies as well? The quietness here, the no touch.
I think so. I think essentially it does. Yeah, there's a lot of no touch, over understated, terribly restrained, stuff going on, which is fine because if it's done well, articulated well, and sort of cadence and textured well, it's very attractive as well. But it also reflects the psyche of people in certain countries, and that's okay too. For me, the larger the variance, the larger the variations, the better it is for poetry, look at how long it took for Britain and America to recognize slam poetry and performance poetry, but especially by the poets who wrote only for the page for the longest time. Now, to me, just performance poetry or slam poetry can be very exciting, but if it's not done well, and if you go back and reread it on the page, then it falls flat. If it's only cerebral and very beautifully constructed, it's attractive. When you try and read it out, it's not tonally interesting to read, then that can be problematic too. I think somewhere along the line, poetry in the other parts of the world use both the ear and the head and the heart. And that calibration is interesting. Think of a music mixing soundboard with a million buttons and knobs in front. It depends on us as an artist, as a poet, where we want the bass and the treble and the mid-range. That's how we calibrate the knobs and take the sonic spaces to that. It's partly cultural, but also it's when you remove certain parts of an essential thing called language or poetry, then you're becoming unidimensional. But if you use all the aspects, then I think it lives and floats and flies. And often, like Icarus, even if it's not good enough, it should be burnt. Yes.
Well, sorry about that. I suddenly got a coughing fit. But I
think it was because I said, read the book Argumentative Indian, and you got a shock.
Yes, I thought I better go get some water. Shall we just? It's a shame we can't really have a Q&A because we've only got about 10 minutes left. But I just wondered if Sarah and Jane and Siddeep, if there are any questions or ideas that have just come up between your 3 wonderful readings, which I thank you all very, very much for. If you'd just like a little chat before we go, some people are beginning to have to leave anyway, so it would be nice to use the last 10 minutes just for you to talk about your experience today of each other's poetry. I'd love to hear that.
So I have a few queries for Jane to start with, and then Sarah maybe. I mean, Jane, we were talking about language and so on, and your poems, in a sense, in terms of balance, gets it all right, and you're as English as they get. Your poems are.
I am half Scottish, Siddeep.
Oh, that's a relief. Thank you. but the poems are restrained. They are exact. They are perfectly pitched. Yet there's so much philosophical space in your poems, and the beautiful lyricism that is sort of embedded in your poetry. You get that right, and in fact, you're teaching poetry. Why is it, perhaps, and I'm flipping the question back at you, that it's a tradition people have lost? Because remember, what was the birth of poetry? Beowulf. I mean, why did people write poetry? Because it was a very practical thing. You had to remember things by heart. So rhyme and rhythm was invented. The first history of poetry was oral and was passed down from generation to generation. And that's why we use rhyme and rhythm, because it's easy to remember. So from that kind of tradition, why has it become so far removed? In general, I mean, these are very general things, but you get it right. But I just thought what you think when you teach it.
Well, I think there's a lot of poetry which is producing a new kind of music. I mean, if poetry is the utterance or the notation on the page of the poet's voice, or the voice in their head, or the rhythm of their utterance, it's a very performative thing, poetry. So in a sense, there's a sort of personality in the poetry, which inevitably is the poet's personality, whatever you might want to do with the shape of the dance, as Michael Donaghy called it. And I think there's a lot of very, very exciting poetry, which, like as in music, as in film, in fact, which is tuned to different rhythms, a different urgency of utterance, depending. And I think that's great, actually.
I mean, or non-utterance, for instance. I mean, if you think of, say, Wim Wenders' wonderful black and white film, The Wings of Desire. First, the entire film is shot in a canted frame. It's at 45-degree angles, most of the time is shot. But it has very little, utterances. It's all visual silences. Yes. But it's just so powerfully strong and lyrical and full of words, which are not uttered, really.
But in that, there's a lot of silence. That is what I think is interesting that is happening in poetry in English from kind of all over the world, and no doubt in other languages too, which I'm reading in English translation, is this choreographing of language on the page, on the stage of the page, if I can do that kind of stage page thing with it. And I think
like the town gown thing.
Yeah, I just, well, I hope not, really hope not. But yeah, it's the kind of just zizzing up its performance on the page, which I think is in some way related to the sense of the kind of montage, something fractured and montage. We're endlessly building jump cut sense out of jump cut input. Yeah, and that's what you're finding in a lot of new work on the page by young poets, established. I think that's fascinating. I think that's, very energizing.
Yeah. How do you splice the jump cut? Is it's a new way of splicing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
It's interesting that Christopher Logue's translation of the Iliad was pretty well a film script, because he wrote for film. And also he's very influenced by jazz, and he'd been a soldier, so his diction and his register was very, very much the register of soldiery, if that's a word. And it was just like this fast-paced film passing in front of your eyes as you read it, and very, very violent. But I think he was doing that, then, you know, that whole thing about film influencing poetry.
You know, I think at the end of the day, you know, it depends on how seriously you take poetry. I mean, poetry at one level is just painfully solitary, the rewards of few, and it's an obsessive art. So we do it because we don't have a choice, you know, and which is why, you know, it continues regardless of whether there's an audience or not. And Sarah, I had a sort of similar kind of, you know, entry. I'm going to go back to this whole idea of electric photovoltaic nature. You know, can you talk a little bit about science in poetry? And, you know, something that interests me a lot because I come from that background, though I don't practice it.
Well, I at the moment, I'm very much enthralled to Steve Ely's book, The European Eel, because I think he's done something quite extraordinary in that poem. And for a long time, we've been taught that scientific words can be rather irksome in a poem, and they can give you a jolt and you can feel that you're going somewhere technical and it's taking you right away from your left brain, right brain interaction into something but Ely has written this absolutely passionate piece, which is an epic monology of the life of the European eel, which is it gets, the egg it comes from is in the Sargasso Sea, and ocean currents take it across to Europe. And as it goes, it develops all sorts of new capacities. And then when it gets to the mouths of the European rivers, the Tagus, the Severn, the Humber, and so on, it begins to be able to smell and to have a will of its own and to swim. And it goes up the river and finds a place and hangs onto the bank. And that's where it grows into something substantial. But then how does it get back all the way to the Sargasso Sea, where it does its mating? And Steve Ely said, and it reminded me of what people were saying about humility in the face of the material. Steve put a huge amount of effort into studying this and talked to all the scientists and read 200 scientific papers. And he established the boundary of what's known. And so his epic takes us on the first stage, and then he captures the eel and keeps it in his garage and has a good look at it. And then he envisages it getting back to the Sargasso Sea, and we don't know that, but he invents that. And so he is based upon very firm scientific ground. And then he takes us off into the most extraordinary account, more and more passionate, which ends in the most terrific sort of romantic Liebestod. It's really quite amazing to hear him read it, where the eel dies in flagrante, you know, and that's the end of that. And there are a whole lot of new eels. I'm not really doing justice to this at all. But what he has done is to insert into his narrative, he's disrupted the pentameter consciously with great chunks of beautifully deployed, strictly scientific words. And so he talks about the eel's Miocene grin, and it's absolutely beautiful, and at the same time, deeply passionate. And he said that his aim is to write in how, in the age of the great mass extinction, it's really important for poets to write in a way which is ethically and scientifically credible. And so my goodness, I mean, I think this is a very powerful challenge and a sort of also almost a moral injunction.
No, you're absolutely right. You're talking about ethically, you know, because, you know, when I'm teaching, and like you, so many of us teach, you know, poetry and creative writing, you know, I have to tell my students that, you know, fiction and poetry rules are the same. You have to get the grammar straight. Just because you're writing poetry, you can't, you know, you can chop up a sentence as you want, but syntactically it still has to make sense. And it's, oh no, but, you know, this is poetry. We can do anything, you know. But, you know, I want to bring Jenny back because she very humbly has been just the moderator and the discussant, and she's such a brilliant poet, such a fine poet, and she brings historiography and lyricism and the use of long lines, I think, and then she brings aspects of performative drama into her poetry. So you know, maybe you should just tell us a little bit about that, because you know, I know you're super modest and you've got a PhD in modesty.
I'm just looking, I've got 2 minutes officially. We can go on chatting after, but I know people are needing to leave, and I just wanted to finish on this wonderful event, which I think has been absolutely beyond all expectations. That's what people have said in the chat as well. I just wanted to finish it with Sarah. Sarah began the event, and I just want to finish it with photovoltaic, the meaning which I should have said before you started reading, really, Sarah, but it means to be able to produce electricity from light. Life on Earth is possible because green plants and plankton convert sunlight to electricity that powers photosynthesis. And then this wonderful line, all other creatures live indirectly on this captured sunshine.
Beautiful.
So that's what we owe our planet, and all your readings in some ways have touched on the importance of humanity and of respecting humanity. So thank you all very much. And thank you to the audience. You've been absolutely wonderful, putting terrific, interesting things into the chat. And I've actually put my email rather belatedly. I should have done this earlier, but I put my email into the chat. So if you want to email me about anything, or if you would like me to send you a copy of the recording, or if you'd like to ask Siddeep, Jane or Sarah any more questions, just email me and then we can all keep in touch. So thank you very much officially, but I think we can go on chatting if you would like to for a little bit.
Yeah, well, thank you all. Thank you, Sarah and Jane. I was just extraordinary. I was just, I feel, you know, I learned so much more. Thank you both.
Likewise, and thank you again, Jenny. Massive thanks to Jenny.
And Jenny.
Thank you very, very much, Jenny, and everybody. Fantastic.
Yes, I think you've done very well. Shall we end now?
Yes, we should stop the recording at least.
I think we'll stop. Yeah, okay. So stop.